the most human we can be is when we're possessed by a force that's bigger than ourselves.
We live in an age where we tend to think of text as just words on a screen or on paper. No, this was somebody's soul.
When one image is illuminated at a time, narrative naturally emerges.
Oh, dear diorama, tell me why do the things that are beautiful always have a darker side? Oh, dear diorama, tell me why is the good never good enough? Underneath the dirt and scar is an old and familiar face.
Hi, welcome back to another episode of The Ladder, Journeys in Platonic Mysticism. Today, I am super excited to introduce the illustrious P.D. Newman. He's the author of several amazing books, including, of course, dear to my heart, Theurgy, Theory and Practice, Mysteries to the Ascent, Mysteries of Ascent to the Divine, Tripping the Trail of Ghosts, right? This is an amazing book and an amazing title, actually, because yeah, it gets us into the kind of continuity and connection from what we would think would never be related, which is something like ancient mystery traditions, theurgy of antiquity in the Mediterranean, and indigenous tribes and their particular rituals here on what we now call the American soil. So could you tell me why you could hold both these traditions or various traditions together as belonging in something shared?
Well, it came about by accident. I had just finished writing um, the book on theurgy and was at a conference in Yorkshire and was talking to an author named Brian Murarescu, who wrote a book called The Immortality Key. And he's got a background in classics, so I'm telling him about the book and the model of ascent. And nearby us are Graham Hancock and Dennis McKenna, and they're having their own conversation, but overheard ours. And Graham turns around and says, "Oh, you're talking about the path of souls." And I said, "No, I'm talking about this ritual application of Platonic metaphysics." And he said, "Well, I heard everything that you said, and it corresponds equally to this path of souls." He said there are these two portals in the sky, and the objective is to get through them and on to the Milky Way. And I was thinking, you got to be kidding me. How can these two models be so similar? So I found this book called Path of Souls by a great scholar named Gregory Little that turned out to live just an hour from me. But when I got home from Yorkshire, the book was waiting on me, and sure enough, it was uncanny, the similarity in the two models, um, and that just kind of put me in. I tend to really, I'm kind of obsessive with whatever I'm researching. I devoured everything I could on the topic, and in that process, mainly because I come from a background of psychedelics. That's really how I got into all this type of research. But I started seeing things that didn't necessarily jump out at other scholars who were looking at this material primarily because they weren't looking for um, potential references to use of psychedelics in the ritual context in which they would be employed. So I really felt like I had something new I could contribute to that field of research.
No, it's really amazing. I was thoroughly convinced by the connections between this kind of liminal, guide or the psychopomp, where the sage or the shaman within in the indigenous Mississippian traditions has to experience this path in order to be able to guide the dead, and the same with the theurgist, right? Like the Orphic understanding of like having not just to philosophize and to have the theory of these things, but to have to undergone it so that they could be more effective guides. Like where, like, because I have my intuitions about why there is a similarity between these traditions that shouldn't have any historical or material connections. But I want to hear what you think. Why do you think that there's something similar about the role of the shaman or the psychopomp to lead you, much like Dante's Virgil, through hell?
That's a good question, and I think a part of it could be the reason for the universality of it could simply be that we're all humans and we're all under the same sky and with the same constellations, and I think everyone that exists has a mother and a father, and I think these factors naturally contribute to potentially contribute to this kind of ubiquitous approach um, to that liminal process and contacting the other side, um, and the even past the psychopompic role of the shaman, um, the similarity in the models, it really is a mysterious thing. Because we if there was communication between these cultures, we don't know about it. Um, but even beyond them, we see it in the Pyramid of Unas, in the pyramid texts, where it's talking about the same thing, But in that case, it's interesting because Unas doesn't have a psychopomp, right? His psychopomp becomes the pyramid texts. So we get into that territory of the sacred text that becomes personified, and I think like that's what we see in like Islam with the Quran. We see it in Christianity with their approach to the Bible. It becomes personified in a way so that the psychopompic role gets transferred to the sacred text. And I find that fascinating that it's fairly universal. Once the sacred book phenomenon happens, after religion is more of a practiced, ritualized structure. Once the phenomenon of the sacred book emerges, it seems to become the psychopomp, and like I said, I find that really interesting and strange at the same time.
This is one of the reasons why I'm on the kind of journey that I am on, because these books, these amazing books that compromise what we now call the humanities, right? That as Plato kind of insinuates in the Phaedrus, that we can write in such a way that they're alive, right? They're animated with spirit. That we live in an age where we tend to think of text as just words on a screen or on paper, versus like, no, this is somebody's soul, like being put into the wax tablet or written on to the cave, as it is on your chapter. I think it's chapter 2 that's on caves, right? Again, that's another
Yeah,
like beautiful connection, right? But this kind of drawing or painting, so that you inspire, that you're connected to some person who may not yet have been born, but you have this kind of sense in which this has to be done. Yeah, what do you think about that living text and the kind of psychopomp that isn't necessarily a sage or a shaman or a theurgist? Yeah, how do you think we could reorient ourselves to seeing that particular liminal sacredness?
well, it makes me think of Empedocles, that where he says that that ideas are conscious, that everything participates in consciousness to the degree that it's capable, and he says that these ideas that come to you, if you will give them the attention they deserve, they will stay with you and give birth to more ideas. But if you don't, they fly off and look for their own kind. And
Mm.
he also seems to imply that even words are conscious, and that really, when we look at something like the name as statue, the name of I think it's Proclus commenting on a Pythagorean teaching, but that the very words of things are like fractals of the things they describe, much like an ensouled statue. So um, I think that Empedocles idea, it he really was kind of anticipating what Plato uh, was, I think, and I think is what you're saying, what I think he was trying to say, that these texts don't have to be something just dead and injunctive. It can be something that's alive and dynamic and become a guide. Once Plato's gone, like you said, his soul is in these texts. And in a way, just like his name is a statue, his texts become a statue. And if you really engage with them, it's amazing how you can read it one time and think you know what it means and walk away with this confidence, and then read it a second time or discuss with another person who's read it and get equally valid readings from it. And there's this great book. I can't remember the guy's name, but he's talking about the limits of text. It's a book on the origin of symbols, but pushing the texts to their limits, you know, because we see from a lot of scholars, academics, that will say, no, that's not in the text. You're putting that in the text and the way you're reading it. But nobody has a right to draw that line. If it can be found in the text, it's just as valid as a reading, even if it seems outlandish or unconnected from what we imagine the author to tend to want to say, if that makes sense.
No, no, no. This happens to me all the time when I give the argument that the opening frame of the symposium is in a house of sex work or a brothel, right?
Mm,
Uh, and that I have textual evidence that can, actually show that. And it's just they can't see it because, they didn't have the same lived experience as I did. Like for me, it was obvious. Like it's like, oh, it's right here. Like the
right.
language, the way that the unnamed companions, the itinerary, call Apollodorus, "Oh, how did you get the nickname Softy when you're so savage everywhere else?" Right? Like, who talks like that? So, in any case, the point is that you were talking about how being able to see these things because it's obvious from which the lived experience, the embodied experience that you have had, where you can speak to the animated spirit of what looks dead and not important or something to mourn and get over. It's not really there.
Hmm.
But then no, you open the book and or you look at the painting, you see the life because you actually lived it. So go back to Empedocles, as you were saying, like attracted to like, right? Is that
Mm,
you have to have that kind of inner guide, if you will, that allows you to see, as Diotima would say, that kind of spark of pregnancy within even something as simple as a word, right? And so,
right.
okay, I'm sorry, I'm getting excited. Sorry.
That's a
Could you tell
great.
me
It's a
more?
great point.
Yeah, could you tell me more about animated statues and sold statues? Things like I have written down here the twins, the bear. Oh, you made an amazing point about Odysseus as well, but I'll let you just tell me more about ensouled state statues in your book, Ghost, Tripping with the Ghost. So,
Well, I first encountered the idea of animated statues when I was writing my second book, Angels in Vermilion, which focuses on this alchemical lineage that begins in late antiquity and goes all the way into the Enlightenment, but they are preoccupied with a certain entheogenic substance that they're producing from these species of acacia that have NN-DMT in them. But the most widespread use of DMT in the indigenous world is within the context of ayahuasca. And with ayahuasca, it necessitates the addition of a monoamine oxidase inhibitor to render that NN-DMT orally active. And I came across fragment 224 in the Chaldean Oracles, where it's giving instructions for the animation of a Hecate statue. And in the construction of the statue, it calls for a number of psychoactive substances, but it says first and foremost to construct the statue using savage rue or wild rue. Now, in the ancient world, and we see this in Pliny, um, there's two forms of rue. Even though botanically we know they're separate, in Pliny's day they were treating them as the same plant. Only one is wild and the other is cultivated. So the cultivated roux is ruta graveolens, which is it's an additive that was put in wine in Roman times. It's been used in Catholic contexts for benedictions. But then what's known as Syrian roux, Paganum harmala, is probably the richest source of harmine alkaloids in the plant world, and is what's most commonly used for non-indigenous persons exploring ayahuasca, because it's more readily available, and it's so much stronger. You can use less of it. And it's also less intensive because you're not pounding these Banisteriopsis caapi vines to make ayahuasca. It's just so much simpler. But that's how I first got to thinking about animated statues. And the more I looked at many of these, in addition to the suntamata that are being used to produce them, that these plants, metals, minerals, animals that are within the domain, under the rule of these specific planetary deities, much of it is pharmaca. And pharmaca, as you already know, is a complicated term because it first and foremost, etymologically, it implies pharmacy, a pharmaceutical. It implies a drug. And it comes to represent um, magic itself. It comes to represent anything that can cause an effect through an unseen mechanism. So a poem could be a pharmaca, a pharmacon, but in the earliest application of it, it tends to indicate a magical plant that causes a change in consciousness, that you can't point your finger at how it's happening. And it, it starts showing up in virtually every recipe that I can find. There are only a few recipes. Most of them are just discussions on this statue is animated and sold. This philosopher was able to make them speak, or this one was able to walk by a statue and know if it was ensouled because he would go into a frenzy. But where you can find um, discussions on the specific suntamata involved, the pharmaca seems to be universal in it. And August Oosthuizinus, I know you're probably familiar with his work, but he stresses that all through uh, um, his was it philosophy as a rite of rebirth, and theurgy in late antiquity. He says the same thing. He's constantly saying to animate these statues, they're hiding pharmaca in these hidden cavities in them. And that's interesting because these substances are psychoactive because they're carrying neurotransmitters, things like, NN-DMT, which are literally the things necessary for consciousness to be present, and that this couldn't have been known, in late antiquity, and not in the way that we think about a neurotransmitter, but that's precisely the things that you would see present in something that you would determine to be a conscious entity, right? And the practice that I'm most familiar with, within this context is in Palo Mayombe, where we have what's called a prenda or a nganga, and it's a pot, the spirit pot, and it's meant to contain the spirit of the mpungo, kind of like a god, um, that you work with, but the contents change with the mpungo. Um, in the same way that the suntamata for a statue of Apollo would contain more solar plants and stones, versus a statue of Artemis would contain more lunar correspondences. Well, it's the same with these pots. But once all of these different pieces are put together. And it's just like when Plotinus is saying, that soul is an easy thing to harness, but soul is dispersed throughout nature. So we have to take from each kingdom and put them all in one place, and then soul becomes present. And it's the same with these prendas. Now in the Mississippian context, we don't see cavities where they're putting substances. Um, Instead, we see them being animated through a type of birthing ritual, similar to how statues in the Hindu tradition are birthed when they're ensouled. There are certain washings with herbs, but it's largely a magical incantation kind of a situation. So it's different, but it's still animated, and when we think about Native American statuary, we don't tend to think about marble statues. That's something we usually think about Greek, Roman. But they were making marble statues in Mississippi. There are two great examples that were discovered at the Etowah mounds. These two seated statues that are just so elaborately carved, and not what we would normally associate with the Mississippian culture. But I think it speaks to uh, the sophistication of it, and how, again, you asked the question about how is this ubiquitous. um, I think it probably has a lot to do with seeing ourselves in other. We really don't know who we are until someone or something shows us to ourselves by demonstrating what we either want to be or don't want to be. And I think just as much as in another person, we can find ourselves in a statue, in a piece of art, in a ritual itself. So I think in a big way, uh, these practices serve to, if not create a soul for ourselves, to at least make it observable and objective and more tangible. And in a big way, it's an encounter with self.
I was just lecturing on the importance of that in an author named Maria Lugones, right? In World Traveling, that one of the things that we have to do is recognize the actual difference, but also the difference within, right? So that when you start really seeing that you're a multiplicity of various different signatures, of various different aspects of what it means to be alive, to be human, to be ensouled, to be animated, then it makes everything else light up with this plurality, right? This plurality that somehow is still paradox one, right? So that yes, it is just a little pot, but it's a little pot with ridges, so that you know that it has the medicine in it, so that we're not in a particular culture that is yet reading. I just love that about your chapter one. This kind of discover, was it in chapter one or the introduction, where you really get into the material culture, right? Like we when we because this is really important, even for studying theurgy and at the Greek world, is that we sometimes pass over the importance of these material artifacts that give us more insight into the spirituality, into the philosophy. But no, like as you carefully show in your book, like these are signatures, these are showings, these are ways people communicate when they do their sewing, or they make these pots, or they construct and draw on the walls, so on and so forth. That these are part of the window in to animating, say, a dialogue, or recognizing that those marble statues are speaking because they were made to speak, right? Like they were in soul, they were birth, and oh, that's what I wanted to get to. So you said very early on, we all have a mother and a father, and I am so drawn to a lot of the authors that I'm drawn to because of this analogy of constant rebirth and birthing and bringing into being. So that you see this with diadema and the symposium, that what it means to pass on the pedagogy of immortality is a process of seeing that people are pregnant in soul, and that what we have to do is give people, the opportunity to bear what is within them. But then these rituals here, and it shows that in the dirt, in the people, in the land, because you're from Mississippi, you're from that area, right? If I remember correctly. It's, to write this book, it's almost as if the land called to you and said, "Remember the dirt from which you came," right? And it isn't just a story that we were told in sixth grade history class. It's something deeper and more mysterious, and
It
and
did
there's.
in a big way. I've always said that we we owe we owe a form of worship to at least two pantheons of deities. One being the pantheon of our blood, where we come from ultimately, if not more, because most of us are mutts, but at least to the best that we can determine, we owe recognition to a pantheon of gods from which our blood runs, and we owe our worship to the pantheon of the soil on which we stand. And so you're absolutely right. And it really became tangible when I was able to visit Picture Cave, which is ground zero for the Mississippian iconography. But being in that cave, it's in the dark zone, so you 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 can't see everything all at once. Um, and and if you think about how the natives would have encountered it, they would have had a torch. It would have been torch lit, which would have only illuminated one icon at a time. And when you do it in that way, narrative naturally emerges. If you see the whole picture, it's almost like um, the whole thing becomes a phenomenon. But when one image is illuminated at a time, narrative naturally emerges. And uh, for me, it was one of the most magical experiences of my life, because I've always read in these archaeological texts about caves, and about how the natural contour of the stone will be incorporated into the image. But until you're standing there looking at it, it doesn't hit you that this is something that likely emerged as a god, as another spirit, but emerged naturally from that backdrop. And you can feel that even today, that you're looking at something that has its own agency. You can sense it has its own autonomy. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for me, where I was, all in on, this Mississippian, the culture, the iconography, and really seeing it validated in a way that like I said, we tend to reserve for, the Greek miracle. You know what I mean? It's just
Mhm.
as sophisticated, just as complicated. It's just that there's no written language, but once you understand how they're, like you said with the pots, how do you label a pot that is created to contain a narcotic substance that could be potentially fatal? Um, when you have children running around, how do you, if you don't have a language, how do you label that? And you do
Mhm.
that through reproducing the substance symbolically in the pot. And I think there's a lot of crossover with the way these caves function and the specific icons, because they do uh, have what am I trying to say, aspects to them that tell you something about how they function in the world we live in. if that makes sense. I get so excited with them, especially with the picture cave thing, because I think so many Americans are want to go to Egypt to visit the pyramids, to go see Stonehenge, but don't realize that right here we have our own pyramids, our own Stonehenge that are just as remarkable and just as mind blowing in the way they apply it to their lives.
No. No, this is one of the things I live on 20 acres, and I remember when I first got here, promised I would try to name every tree. But it's one of those things that you never actually get around to doing that. But the point is this kind of, like shifting our gaze just a little bit to remember, right, that there there's more to this world and this property, and putting like regulating it, and buying a house, and then you go out and there's a target, and like you forget, right, that we used to lie in the grass and stare up. I mean, I often think that I just want to be a child again, where you get to hold, and this is a way of saying Thanksgiving. It's a way of saying, I let myself relax into this earth. I let myself stare into the sky. I let myself see the sacredness in this place because it's asking me to. Like how many times do people just walk past something they can feel is asking you to lay down and enjoy it, right? Like to really recognize that connection of you, as you have been saying, right? And that what happens when you see this connection between land and animals and yourself and others, that you do have the power to see that the statue is alive, or that the book is alive, or that history is not dead and gone. One of the things I see as thematic in your work is the theme of um, this alchemical necromantic kind of aspect to these traditions, as both within the Platonic world, if you will, or the sacred rites of the Mediterranean area. And I say Mediterranean area because I want to emphasize that they're not hegemonic, right? Like there's pluralities of different rituals. So I always want to be like, when people say the Western philosophy or Western spirituality, I'm like, which one?
Which one?
So there's hundreds of hundreds and hundreds. But the point is that you find this as a theme in Mississippian indigenous culture as well, right? That this path of souls is a path of, because you open your book with avoid death. This poem that's basically don't is it's a poem, right?
Um, it, it, I guess you could call it a poem.
Yeah. Just to
It's in, but
emphasize.
it's injunctive, but it's poetic. Yeah,
So sorry, I guess it would be more like a ritual call. Is that what you would say?
yeah, definitely, definitely.
Okay.
And also
The
an
point is,
educative tool for children, for those who aren't within the sodalities that teach this stuff.
right. Well, the call that is the opening in your book is, in fact, don't go down the path of death. Don't go down that path of death. And I think about Socrates and the Phaedo, and I think about why, at the end of the Phaedo, he emphasizes that he's not going to die, right? Like that he's like that what he's going to become is a good daimon for everybody in the room who has followed and understood the pedagogy of the soul, the teachings that he's been trying to pass down. And so that when Crito says, what should I do with your kids? He's like, just teach them the pedagogy that I have been trying to teach you guys, because this is the pedagogy, this is the paideia, this is the pathway. So again, he himself is putting in his position of the future psychopomp, who instructs us so that we, can follow and recognize that there is a path that avoids this thing called death, that most people are complacently, like Nietzsche would say, happy cows blinking in that direction, versus, this kind of crazy idea that you can live a certain way of life once you start walking a different pathway, and being guided daimonia by a good spirit that says we shall not die, there is the immortal soul, and so Yeah, what do you think of those two connections? I mean, I know from what I've read what you might say, but I'd like to hear what you think. And so,
Well, I think
what
in a
it,
big way, that shift of perspective, once it takes place, every moment becomes this eternal moment that we participate in. And I think that is really the beginning of life. Until then, we are on this kind of autopilot sleep track, that if death exists, that's what it looks like. But I think once we wake up to the eternal moment, death becomes an impossibility, even at the demise of the physical body. Um, and what was the second part of that question?
it was just this connection between this kind of, because you called it necromancy in one of your books, and that's like, people tend to, all right, I'm turning off my computer now. That there's no such thing as that. But no, like these spiritualities, right? That they're arguing the same thing. Like when we use the word necromantic, we're immediately spooked out. Versus, almost every
Sure.
teenager in a
Okay.
philosophy class
Yeah.
years old reads Plato's Phaedo on the immortality of the soul, and it gets weight, right? Like I mean, I think they both deserve weight, is what I'm trying to say. But why is it that we're so easily like, this is the woo woo versus this is the scholarly philosophical text? Why is it that we make these things when they're both saying the same thing, that we don't die? Where's the bias here? I guess what I'm asking you.
Well, in a lot of these older cultures, the awareness of the presence of the ancestors is a constant. And in Palo, for instance, there's this saying that we're only alive to the degree that the dead can move through us. The moment we become shut off from that, and the dead cannot move through us, is the moment we become what we imagine the dead to be. Um,
Mm,
but this idea of the ancestors always being present, I think, is a big clue, to how one can step into that worldview and understand that death does not have to exist in the way that we imagine it. And even on a psychological level, I don't know if you're familiar with Jacques Lacan's, he calls it name of the father or the dead father, but it's this idea that once the father is gone, um, the child obeys his law even more firmly, which is through what in psychology they call deferred obedience. But but what he's observing is that the ancestor looms that much largely the moment they become an ancestor, and are not a parent or an authority figure in our life. But even just on a psychological level, it's true that our dead almost have more agency than we do, and
mm.
that view in itself, I think, allows us to say, one day I will be an ancestor, and that's when I.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, this idea that, because I think about my mother, who passed when I was 30, right? And yeah, you can't help but, have certain anger issues, and, you can't, you think you can't change it. Now it's over and done and gone. But, flash forward however much time it is after somebody you love has passed, and you soften, right? You remember things a little differently, or you remember it exactly the same way, but you remember yourself differently, right? And like the magic of being able to feel that even the dead change and grow, right? That they're there still whispering, like, even if it's don't do that, as Socrates's daemon did. And I would argue Socrates' daemon is, in fact, the voice of his mother, saying, "Don't blaspheme, don't blaspheme." As you know, I would argue, because that's what's ringing in his ear, right? A woman who always just kind of just protected him from making mistakes out of hubris. And so, no, I mean, this is. I agree. I think that if we're going to talk about agency, that there's something that the dead can do. They can penetrate our hearts without even a word, because they're just in the ether. They're in everything that we do. I mean, I tend to think, I also think about, technology and things like this, and, that certain ghosts of the past, they didn't want tech to be used in the way that it is these days. And so, of course, it's going to be doing strange things in some such way, because it's saying, this was not my intent. I did not intend to
Yeah.
make a motley cow. And so that
Yeah.
we, have to interact and react and have a relationship with these things that show that we respect what all of nature is, which is this constant becoming, right? And this constant becoming that can always be otherwise, because nature loves to hide and seek. In any case, I'm rambling, but I want you to know I'm very inspired
No,
by
you're spot on. You're
yeah.
spot on.
Uh,
And I think about the Bantu people in Congo. There's evidence that they broke away from Egypt eons ago, but they would make statues out of their ancestors. And when we think about a mummy, um, we don't immediately realize that these are animated statues. The physical remains, once they are encased in this golden coffin, the ancestor is becoming the god, right?
mm,
And the animated statue of the god. And we see this with the Bantu culture prior to the Spanish arriving, and really when the Muslims came. But they would take the remains of their ancestors and animate them with suntamata, which are in this context, in the way it was inherited in Palo, it's called bilongo, which means medicines, But each of these ancestors would be made into a statue of one of the mpungo, of one of the gods, So in a very real way, um, the ancestor becomes the conduit, the channel that allows the descendants to maintain a connection with deity itself. And when we're talking about, you know, if you look at the world as even in the simple dualism of the sensible and the intelligible, um, even in that kind of a simple duality, the if the world of the sensible is the realm of what we call the living, well, the other side of that is the realm of the gods, the realm of the forms, but it also becomes the realm of the dead, because it becomes anything that we're not, right? Anything that we are not when we are existing in a body and functioning in a society. So anything that is separated from that becomes the big other. Um, so the idea that death becomes the beginning of life, but also becomes uh, the conduit for contact with deity. That's a profound idea to me. And it's easy to find the divine in matter if you know how to look, but I don't think many people know how to look. I didn't know how to look until I started foraging. And started learning what plants I could find, and then getting into what rocks, because even the stones, the minerals change with where you are, and the plants change with the seasons, and what animals are in your area. Once I started tapping into those things, signatures started emerging on their own, and once I started seeing the signatures of the gods and of the planets in these plants that I'm foraging, um, that's when the idea of theophagia really hit me. That every time I I consume say a plant that has a solar signature, I'm eating the god and in a way becoming the god and participating with the god to the degree that I'm capable. Um, so yeah, even here we can find the gods, but I think it's much easier for somebody that's not immersed in these mystical traditions to project that into another realm, a separate realm. And I think that's just as valid, but point being, it doesn't matter which realm we're talking about. It's all full of gods, like Thales would say.
Would
It's
say.
all full of the gods. Yeah.
So tell me, yeah, to get into the personal, like you've had a lot of experiences with psychedelics. You've done a lot of research on their use throughout the world, not just in theurgy or in the Americas. Um, and so, you know, could you give us a kind of insight into why you think they're valuable, what it is that they teach? And so I know that you also make you do a very good job of explaining the differences between different kinds of psychedelic pharmacon. So again, I want to emphasize, I'm not asking you this question because I think it's trippy, right? I am asking you this question because I do believe, you go back to the Odyssey and Hermes, gives the pharmacon to help Odysseus or Circe, and and Circe is not just a witch; she's a goddess with her own pharmacon, and so that we've got references to this. It's obvious to me that the Eleusinian mysteries contained air god or psychedelic
Something.
substance. Yeah,
Something
something,
for
right?
sure.
Or at least, the exhaustion that they would have induced, something similar to a psychedelic experience. But no, the ergot is just to me clear, right? When Plato has the princess, I forget her name, at the beginning of Phaedrus, she was she was swept up by the wind. I'm definitely a proponent of reading those myths as that. No, it says that she was playing with pharmacon, so she was high, and somebody violated her in that state. Like that's how that text particularly opens, and it's like it's of course it's right here, but we see pharmacon and we're like, oh, whatever. So my point is that could you tell us what you think the benefits spiritually, intellectually, yeah, your life, your practical life, of relating to psychedelics in a way that produces, yeah, wisdom or new ways of life. So,
Yeah. Well, just like I was talking about with foraging, um, each psychedelic also is possessed of its own signature. And in Kabbalistic terms, we could say that when we consume a certain psychedelic, it propels our consciousness into that sephira, into that sphere of being, of mind. Um, but each, like you said, each different substance works on the soul in a different way, and some of them, like something like peyote or San Pedro cacti, both of which contain mescaline. Mescaline is an amphetamine, so it has the stimulant aspect to it, but it causes the mind to race and move with thoughts that you had previously never considered. So it's naturally takes on a mercurial quality.
mm,
So in terms of soul work, my approach is very much what deity, what sphere of consciousness does this specific plant allow me to commune with? Because if we were talking about something like datura, which is more of a deliriant, it doesn't do the same thing as something like mescaline, and its effects are much more saturnal and in some cases lunar.
mm,
So,
mm.
in one sense, that's really my approach is a magical approach to psychedelics. Many people have more of a medicinal approach, and I think that's just as valid. I've used them medicinally myself. When I had a car accident in 2015 that gave me transient global amnesia. I didn't know what year it was. I thought we were living in Memphis when we were living in Tupelo. Everything was jumbled. Um, and I started taking microdoses of LSD. Uh, and within a couple of weeks, my mind was back. I was back to normal. And that's speaks to its neurogenerative properties. These substances, especially tryptamines and ergotamines and phenethylamines, they have the capacity to regenerate our neurons, uh, which we there's really nothing else that does that can regrow neurons that have been shriveled through trauma or through depression. So the medicinal approach, I think, is very valid. But like I said, mine is more magical, and I don't always um, bring psychedelics to my ritual practice, but I always bring ritual practice to my psychedelics.
Nice,
Because I
nice.
you know, they don't have to be. Ritual can stand on its own, and it's efficacious on its own. Um, but at the same time, we do have endogenous entheogens in us. We have an endocannabinoid system. Our bodies produce NN-DMT, the perhaps the most visionary substance on the planet, produces it endogenously. We don't know under what circumstances or where in the body it's produced, but we know it's produced. So even when we're talking about something like ritual and meditation, it still might be a discussion of psychedelics. It still might be contingent on the body's ability to produce these substances. And there's this great um, Armenian mystic philosopher, G.I. Gurdjieff. That's who's on my shirt today, by the way.
Oh, I
Um,
wondered.
but Gurdjieff, he calls his system the fourth way, and he says the first way is the way of the fakir who through through I think he says a month of physical tortures can get his body to produce a substance that gives him the experience he's looking for. And he's saying this in the 20s, and so way ahead of his time. But he says, but the second way is the way of the monk who, through a week of emotional tortures, can get his body to produce the same substance. And he says the third way is the way of the yogi, who through a single day can do mental tortures and get his body to produce this. But he says the fourth way, which is the way of the sly man, knows how to find these substances in nature, and he puts them in a pill and
Mm.
swallows them and has the same experience with no loss of time. So it seems like he's intuiting that what these substances are, uh, what the experiences they elicit are so similar to what comes about when you practice certain meditations, certain rituals. So it's a complicated question of, is there a mystical experience without neurotransmitter psychedelics? But I think, like I said, I don't think um, psychedelics always have to be brought to ritual, but I do think
No,
ritual
no,
has to be brought to psychedelics.
I think about all the various different mystical experience I've had, without any substance whatsoever, right? The importance, meditate, so meditation didn't always work for me as the ability to produce whatever it is that allows for you to have an epiphany or a vision or a relationship to the divine. I don't, want to romanticize it, right? It's not always gummy bears, I guess is the best way to put it. But the what I want to say is that you know I because for me, my first gateway drug, if you will, was lucid dreaming, and that's the body producing because it started with sleep paralysis, right? And sleep paralysis is the lack of a certain chemical going through your body, so that you feel absolutely 100% awake, and so the body produces certain chemicals, right, that can induce what some people have described as mystical experiences or demonic experiences, and we tend to medicalize it instead of being like, no, what is the body saying? What is the body producing? And having an understanding of the metis or the cunning of this fourth wave for to get back to your example, right? That this figuring out what these pharmacons on these traces. This is what Proclus was talking about. This is why you study nature. You look and you show this kind of reverence when you start noticing, this is an Apollo plant, this is a Hermes plant, this is a Hecate, because again, you're doing that deep categorizing, dialectical, methodical. It's not just for hippies, man, right? But it's for
Right.
people who they have to. It's a work. It's an ascesis. It's a discipline. But we've
Hmm.
turned it into recreation. So as
Right.
to
There are consequences to it, you know. Once you adopt that worldview that everything is a fractal, a token of the God, you're walking through a sacred landscape for good. It completely
Mhm.
changes the dynamic of how you interact with your environment.
Yeah, no, 100%. But thank goodness it does, right? Like, like this, like I said, what I'm always talking about turning in a different direction. And like, once you do, right, it is a path that you can't step off, because why would you? Why would you want to go back
Hmm.
to a world sacred, a world that has lost its sacredness, right? Like
Right.
I remember there was this one young person in my office once, and they were definitely going through it, and you know because what they were going through was that choice of like, I want to see the world this way and its beauty and its immortality and its, but I also know that I need to go get a job, I need to be a lawyer, I need to have a wife and two kids and three dogs and a picket fence, and so this kind of, you could see them wrestling with the super mundane and the mundane, and that's basically what, and the reason why they're wrestling with it is because the mundane says this is crazy. You won't matter.
Hmm.
You'll be irrelevant. You'll need to be medicalized and diagnosed, and so it was one of those moments where I was like, this is the path of beauty, right? Like, yeah, it's gonna be hard, but if you got a little cleverness, you'll be able to walk that line, Johnny Cash style. But in this
And
path,
we can include jobs in that.
yes, and we
Even
can include
jobs
things,
are signatures. You know,
yeah.
I think of everything we do is a ritual. We're always participating in some myth. And a good way to put this is like, anytime you take a bath and you get out of this bath and you have soap suds on you, you are participating in the myth of the birth of Aphrodite from the ocean. Because when we're
Mhm.
we're we're washing, we're contributing to our beauty. We're beautifying ourselves, and just stepping out of that bath water. Um, we think about it as such a mundane thing, but ritually, mythopoetically, what we're doing is participating in that myth. And I don't think there's a single activity we can do that isn't participation in some myth somehow. I think the real goal is to find out what myth am I participating in, and then once we do that, we come to embody gods even more. We come to embody heroes, you know. But I feel like it doesn't matter what we do. We're always participating in some myth, and like you said, she was struggling with the mundane, with getting a job, you know. But we have to also extend the sacred to that, because there's no job that again isn't partaking of some deity, like if you're talking about being a lawyer. Um I immediately think of Horace arguing the case in his myth, you know. So you're even with something like that, you're participating in a divine act whose precedent is with the gods, you know.
No, I mean, this is the importance of like so I have two things I want to say. The importance of like recognizing that it's a vocation. Like you were drawn to it for a reason, right? Like and if you're not happy, that means you don't have a guide there, right? So turn in a different direction, find something else that can light your spirit up, because you know, like when you think you're trapped in your dead end 9 to 5 Joe versus the volcano job, then that's because you decided that. And I know that lots of people would say, oh no, it's I can't do it, I gotta feed my kids. And I'm like, okay, well then find a way to transform it. Like if you really want to to model, you know, this, you know, a way of life that your kids could envy and desire, like show them that you can take this shitty 9 to 5 and still live a life of magic and mystery and beauty and justice and all these crazy ideas, because that's what the soul is here for, right? Is to
Right,
do
right.
that impossible work of making something that seems trivial and stupid into something amazing, right?
We
And
link it up to our Syra, you know, we link our vocation up to our Syra, and that's what makes it make sense.
yeah. And then the second thing I want to maybe perhaps end here, but I really need to have you back on because there's so many other things that I want to talk to you about. But you started off, I don't remember which podcast it was, but you said something in a podcast along the lines of you started off your journey with Jungian archetypical, you know, you were getting into that particular world. And as you're talking about the gods, you're hitting a note that I really like, which is because when people talk to me about Jungian archetypes, I get a little annoying red flag happens because I always think that the way pop culture has received Jung and Freud and you know the psychoanalytic tradition is as mere psychology or mere archetypes, and you know it's a kind of uh, stage play that isn't, you know, like we're it's hard to explain. It's again like they've completely uh, emptied what Jung was doing of this kind of psychopompic activity. Like this is just the Jung is trying to communicate something of this more liminal world, and somehow it's been reduced to something not lived. And so, what I really appreciate about what you were saying is something that I think is really important because you know, Artemis was a woman. Iphigenia was a woman, right? Odysseus was a man, maybe not a man by the name of Odysseus, but a man that inspired the way he lived, inspired people to tell stories and to give divine names. And like these were people in this world, right? And we so loved and recognized their divinity that they made it, they became a signature themselves, right? And again, this ancestor connected. The dead are not dead, as I always say. And so part of what's nice when you were talking about the gods is like you animated the archetypes again, right? You made them not mere archetypes, and so that they, you know, the Aphrodite in the bathtub. That's a I never thought I would say that. Is real. Like you, how you can have a real relationship with something more than even as you step out of the bathtub and wipe soap suds away, because then even soap, right? Like the discovery of what that was, you know, these dead bodies creating fat and lye, and they clean us. They made our, you know, and it took a woman to notice that in this part of the river, the clothes get cleaner. I wonder why. But my point is,
It's magic.
yeah. And so, so yeah, if you don't mind speaking to that kind of get that beautiful, you know, way in which the Platonic tradition, but also the Mississippian tradition, become like a god as far as possible through aligning with your vocation, with your Saira, through your way of life, through the signature that you know you bear within.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's I was thinking about this when we were just talking about vocations, and the possibility that you could choose a wrong one. And
Mm,
I don't think that's possible in a way. I don't think we can ever not be an avatar of the god and participate in a myth. The difference is, can we become conscious of it or not? And that shift is what makes us realize there is no secular, there is only the sacred. And once that happens, it's not that we've all of a sudden embodied a god. We've been the avatar of a god since day one. Every individual thing in the world, in the final analysis, is the gods. So it's not that we can choose to embody it. It's just that we choose to recognize it, and I think we do that through realizing what myth we're participating in. But with Jung's archetypes, um, Freud had hinted at it early on. He called them archetypal, he called them archaic forms. But already by him calling them that, you could it's a callback to Plato by calling them forms. He's realizing that what he's observing in individual psyches, uh, is it's best the best way to look at it, is through the model that Plato had set down. But I think when Jung comes along and really expands this into this archetypal, model, it it really opens it up like a blossom. It blooms, in a way that Freud simply never could have or wanted to accomplish. Um, but what Jung is doing, what his project, uh, was absolutely, muddled by Jungians. I love Jung. I cannot stand Jungians. It's it becomes, it becomes almost a game, with role playing. It becomes something more like,
That's what I was trying
um,
to communicate. Yeah, thank you.
yeah, it becomes more like Pearl's, therapeutic role playing, which can be, beneficial, and it can be fun, but that's not what Jung's talking about. He's talking about something that can possess us. And since The Exorcist came out,
Yeah.
everybody is terrified of possession, but really, possession is the highest grace. If we can be possessed by an idea,
News.
by a form, by an archetype, right? I think that is the highest grace that we can be afforded, and I think that's really what Jung was trying to communicate and rehabilitate, was this idea that the most human we can be is when we're possessed by a god, of a force that's bigger than ourselves.
No, that's beautiful. And I think that's a great way to end. So, thank you so much, PD, for coming. And please, I hope you're open to the idea of coming again, because I would just love, yeah, people who watch this show to have more of a walk in the park with you, and to pick your brain a little bit more. So, thank you so much.
Thank you. Let's do it anytime.
Oh dear.